important thing to recognize when you're in a room full of great tenured professors to just people starting out. So it was a huge range, and I think Karen can speak to the creative side there.
Physical way, but also or like a design way. So it was very, very, very broad. The second one is collaboration. So it's like who you collaborate with and why. And then the third one is communication. So it's how you communicate about your work or about your project.
But really looking at how you develop an idea, where those ideas even come from, how you implement an idea, and what do you do once you're finished with it. Is the answers that got the most. Red is the answers that got the least. And the bottom line is the STEM responses. And what I found really interesting about this is it's really not surprising from a science perspective, the answers that are the top four, which is starting with asking questions. That's the scientific process. We look around, we ask questions, we formulate a hypothesis, get information around it, and we look at the world around us and observe things.
For STEM, but not so common for creatives. And then travel was really inspirational for creatives, but not so much for STEM. Same with there's a divergence with RSS feeds and social media. STEM practitioners find it more inspirational than creatives do. So, we'll do another Slido poll, or blue sky thinking, and think big, and then distill and brainstorm, and then they just kind of dive in and just go for it. And then in the STEM arena, there was lots of mention of researching existing data, which wasn't really true for creatives, but I have hope that that is changing. And then the second step was externalizing. So that's like modeling the idea, strategizing, doing the actual creative work. And then at the very center of it is critique. So it's getting input from others, collecting new information, and reevaluating. And then it's kind of going right back to the beginning again. So it's like, how do you integrate that new data? How do you deal with the input? And what do you do? Like, how far back out does it take you with your ideas?
And if any of you remember from your 7th grade science classes where you saw that cycle, where science starts with a question, and we do the research, we do the experiment, and the last step of the scientific process, which I think a lot of scientists forget, is dissemination, which means putting your research out there so others can learn from it and build on it and ask more questions, and you can learn from it and build on it. And dissemination for me is communication, and I think where we drop the ball as scientists is we just put it out there in a conference or a paper and think that's communicating when it's not, because the other person has to get it. Collaboration. So we looked at where do people find inspiration for in collaborating with other fields? Do they find it useful to collaborate with other fields, and what other fields?
Like inspiration to actually acting on the inspiration and trying to collaborate with somebody. So 25%, or 23% for STEM, which I think, I don't know, I see that as an opportunity for growth and change. The divergences were also very interesting, though I can't say super surprising.
Yeah, definitely not surprising. I mean, data visualization is so important to scientists because we have to visualize our data all the time in figures and tell a story. And education is so ingrained in science because a lot of science happens at educational institutions. So that wasn't surprising. What was surprising that ranked so low for creative education in particular. And the question is why? And like any good study, you do the study and it asks, you get more questions from it. So these are some of the questions that we're asking ourselves after.
Yeah. Christine and I have given this a lot of thought, and to reach out to an actual scientist for any type of collaboration, because they just assumed that the scientists wouldn't be interested in any form of creative work, which I think is super interesting, and also
visual or sonic, and I saw that happen. I saw scientists that refused to work with reporters because they were scared their science would get misrepresented, or they put it out there and somebody would accidentally misrepresent it or sometimes purposely misrepresent it, and they feel like that discredits them as a scientist and their reputation as a scientist for doing bad science. So there's a lot of fear to put your science out there to the public outside of the scientific community because of that. So I think a lot of this is fear too, collaborating. this is something I specialize in, I care about deeply, is the communication. Everybody thought communication was hard. In fact, only 4% of scientists reported never struggling to communicate an effective idea. And I'd like to meet those 4% and judge that myself. And 8% of creatives, only 8% of creatives reported never struggling to communicate a complex idea. Again, I'd like to talk to them too to see if we agree. But the point is, everybody thought communication was hard. Effective communication was hard. But everybody thought communication was important. Effective communication outside of your field was at least moderately important to 99% of the people that took this survey. So the gap is in the skills. The gap is in really thinking about how we communicate better and remembering it's about the other person catching the ball. Development, money, peer recognition, societal impact, public policy, project success, and collaborations. Where you see the hearts, that was extremely important, and X's, it wasn't important at all. And along the side is the percentage of people that agree there. So from a science perspective, I found this really, really interesting, that societal impact and public policy were the two highest for scientists on why effective communication is important with people outside your field. But this is where the problem comes in. Project success was low. And this is where I see the problem in the huge scientific method for a second. The last step of a project is dissemination. It's effective communication. And there, in terms of project success, they're seeing effective communication is low. I think scientists forget what that means, what dissemination means. And in order to make change in policy and make change in societal impact, you have to be able to communicate your project successfully. So this is a huge disconnect, even for people who think this is important. So I found
yeah, and for me, I was looking at the creatives, and I found it was interesting that that they found communication to be important during the idea development phase, during the collaborative phase, and for project success. So to me, that kind of conveys like a timeline, a project timeline that requires communication throughout the duration of the project.
And why the communication skills, their goal right now is to be a mirror, and that will be your goal. Picture yourself looking in the bathroom mirror as if you were getting ready in the morning. Your goal is to be a mirror, okay? Okay, pause them for a second. Who's leading and who's following?
The delay.
There was a delay, right? She would move and then you would move. So were they accomplishing the goal?
No.
No. So what could she have done differently?
Slow down.
Slow down. What else?
Mirrored back. Mirrored back.
Mirrored back. Okay, so just paying attention to the other person and making sure they were ready. Yep. Huh? Agree?
Agree on the movements.
Okay, so if they're not talking, how can they agree?
Eye contact.
Eye contact again, yep.
Body
Body moving, right? Really paying attention, slowing down. Increasing predictability. Yeah, maybe it's starting with some really easy patterns at first, and then once you get it, moving on to something more complex, right? You're not going to turn around at first until you know the other person's ready for you to turn around, and maybe you signal them, your body language can signal them to get them there. So what does this have to do with communication? Everything, right? And whose fault is it that Grace was behind?
That's mine.
Yes, no, I'm glad. So a lot of people will say, it's mine, I couldn't keep up. I hear that all the time, and I want you to think about it from the audience perspective. And the last time you were in a room where you didn't understand something, people go inward and say, oh, I must not be smart enough to get this. I can't keep up. But in reality, it's the person leading. It's their responsibility to make sure you get it. So I'm talking to an audience, and I'm realizing they're way behind me. What do I have to do differently? I have to slow down. I have to maybe come up with an example or something simpler to help them get it, and then build in the complexity once they're ready. So this has everything to do with communication and eye contact. If I'm not looking at them, I can't see that, because you can see that through body language. you can see that there's a gap in understanding just from looking at people. So I want you all to try this. So get with your partner, I want you to try this. I want you to try and be a perfect mirror. This is not about being clever or tricking the person, but it feels good to you, and when there's an emotion attached to it, they're more likely to remember it. So it's a really important, if you want to get your point across, it matters to make the person feel good about it, and it matters that you slow down so they can get it, which is frustrating, and it's frustrating for both sides. I see that in science. Scientists get frustrated and they say, I don't understand why they just don't get it. And because we're not trained to communicate. And I think that's a really important piece. Like, how do we get more people trained in techniques to effectively communicate their work on both sides?
To know your audience. Yeah, the heat map again with like the creatives on the top and STEM on the bottom. You can see that both creative and STEM, asking why is very important. But there's an immediate divergence with empathy when it comes to creative and STEM. Creatives have empathy as number one, and STEM it's not quite as high. Still pretty high, but not quite as high.
Empathy is the number one important thing, is really understanding someone's point of view. Empathy does not mean agreeing with someone. It means understanding their point of view and where they're coming from and what they're bringing to the table, really knowing your audience. And if you don't know your audience, you don't know how to communicate to them in a way it's going to land. Should someone care? Asking why should someone care is very different than asking why do they care. And I just really want to make that distinction. You can think people should care all you want. It doesn't mean they do care. And you have to figure out, do they actually care or not, and why or why not first before you try and communicate about something. We think a big piece of it is the communication, and being able to communicate with different fields in a way that's creative, in a way that's respectful, in a way that's engaging. There's, especially in Karen embarking on this study with me from an academic perspective.
Oh yeah, and me coming from more of like an industry perspective, because one place where we see a lot of opportunity for science and art collaborations is in the realm of ethics. And for me, as an industry professional primarily, or at least at the time of the study, when we would conduct research, it would just be like, you just send out a questionnaire, like you just send out a survey and people would just answer it, and then you take the information back and you look at it, and it's usually pretty simple, pretty quick, like you could do it in like 2 hours, like just throw it up on Facebook and get a whole bunch of thoughts, and then like you've got your answers. That is not what science is like.
No.
Not.
I introduced Karen to the dreaded IRB process, which we will talk about in a minute. But
does anybody know what the IRB process is? Anybody?
A few people, okay, so you know. So we will.
We feel like a lot of the credo at South by Southwest is move fast and break things. Like that's how work gets done quickly. Is like move fast, break things. Fix it later. Like just throw it out there, see how people react to it, and fix it later.
To protect people and around ethics for very good reasons, because science did a lot of bad stuff back in the day, mostly hurting women and communities of color and underprivileged communities. IRB was a way to slow things down and say, you actually have to think about the impact on people before you do the research and before you involve them, and they have to know that they can stop, they have to know their rights in this. So the IRB process was set up for really good reason. The problem is it's very slow. So from when we start study, won't have any negative impacts on participants taking it. And from Karen's point of view, we're just sending out a survey.
Right, yeah. So because that's what our study basically was. And we also had to, through the IRB, and they came back with changes, and then we had to implement the changes and then send them through again. And one of the changes that explains the study, that explains like what you're doing with information, that lets you know that you as a participant in the study can opt out at any time. And I think we actually, as a market researcher, I feel like we lost a lot of people like right then. Like you just lose people like right then. I think our drop off, we probably lost about, I don't know,
It was at least a 20% drop off from people who saw that first and didn't move on, because that can be scary.
That's wrong.
Like, I'm not just answering a survey now, because this makes it scary.
So the commitment, and she really touts the notion of slow science in her book. And in her articles, and the idea behind slow science is that you try really hard to facilitate broad societal consensus. So, there's a unity to it, but it's not unanimous. closed academic labs or closed industry, you know, like just different places. So I thought that was important to bring up.
Technology come into play is around the issue of AI. And again, I don't have an answer to this, I'm just posing the question, but AI has generally been exempt from the IRB process because you're using existing data sets already, and data, as you all know, is collected all the time, out there all the time in these giant data sets. So the ethical questions in using that and creating something is something that society is asking right now and struggling with, especially around AI and how we interact with it. So it's really interesting from the AI and technology standpoint and how the IRB process kind of misses that a bit.
To get consensus and to do slow science, and when is it important to move fast and break things, you know? Like what's the overlap there? Like how do you reconcile that?
And you can just do that, and people do that. You don't have to spend 6 months planning it and showing you know, set this up perfectly, and so, you know, and there are many points in my career as a scientist where I just wanted to ask somebody what they thought and write about it and put that data out there, but I couldn't. So, you know, but I understand why science is slow too, for the ethics reasons. So it was a really interesting, a really interesting experience for me to see what it's like in industry.
There it is, you know, we think that cross-discipline collaborations can help, especially when it comes to ethics.
So that was a big piece that we left doing this study. How do we create those opportunities? I think both of us have also been asked, oh, how did you even get to work with an artist or a scientist?
Yeah.
And what does that actually mean? And what does the idea of collaboration actually mean? I think from a science perspective, they think bringing an artist in at the end to make it look pretty is collaboration. And that's not collaboration. Collaboration is starting at the beginning from idea development, like we did on this study. We came up with this together from the beginning. That's true collaboration. So we really we would love to see that change. And the question is,
Another slide up.
Prevent collaborations. So, you know, one, the funding piece that we talked about before, but also as your research is often funded by grants, in a lot of the granting agencies, they don't encourage collaboration. So there's no way to bring in collaborators. They just want to see the science. They don't want to see these more creative ideas. And also the tenure process in academia does not encourage collaboration. That inherently in the tenure process in how we look at science is going to be key to this. What about from the art perspective? This is a great conference, but people who are coming to South by Southwest are already the converted. You're preaching to the converted of people who agree with this. How do we encourage more things like this in areas where it's mostly scientists or mostly artists, and show those collaborations? And I think tech can help create those spaces with, you know, and in bringing people together.
What I think is interesting is more and more, I think we're starting to see more science startups versus like straight up tech. So that also makes me think about like the slow science versus, you know, move fast and break things ethos, like kind of, yeah.
I can tell you when we first started the Alda Center, we had this great idea to teach scientists communication, and graduate students had to hide the fact that they were taking our classes from their advisors because their advisors thought it was a waste of time them being out of the lab and they weren't going to get good science done. Now that changed after many years and pushing, you know, fighting an uphill battle when they started realizing those students that took our classes started getting awards at conferences and being able to actually communicate lab meetings, and the science of the whole lab got stronger, and then they completely changed their tune. But it took years to prove that. So I think changing that culture is so key to that question.
We could share more helpful information if we included like visual, like other types of art, you know. So, but
This has done a really good job on collaborations and communications. A lot of course scientists have, because I think they fell prey to climate change being miscommunicated, blatantly miscommunicated and misrepresented early on, and people saw the importance of getting involved in that conversation. So I think that's a good field to look to where people have looked outside to collaborations early. I think fields like neuroscience and physics have not necessarily. So, and they're starting to. There are people that care about it, but again, it's changing the larger culture to encourage it.
yeah.